Hi everyone, I'm Carolina and today I'm showing you how to sew the Essential Tee sewing pattern. This is a full body length t-shirt with a short sleeve and long sleeved option. It has a really nice curved hemline and a binded collar crew neck. As always, you can get this sewing pattern on my website, studiocarolinashear.com. It's also the first link in the description. This sewing pattern has been updated to include seam allowance and additional sizes. So if you bought it before this date, you can send me your order number, and if you bought it through my website or through Etsy, and I will send you the updated pattern free of charge. If you sew this piece and post on Instagram or TikTok, please tag me at studiocarolinashear, the same name as here, and use the hashtag #CSEssentialTee so I can see what you make. To make this t-shirt, you'll need a light to medium weight jersey fabric. Both 2-way and 4-way stretch work fine. I'm using 2-way stretch in the video, but you want to make sure that your fabric has at least 50% stretch percentage. If you need help with figuring out the stretch percentage of your fabric, I have a blog how-to guide on the subject, which I will link in the description for you. It's also super important that you pre-wash your fabric, especially jersey fabric, because it's prone to twisting. So if you cut your pieces and sew your garment before washing and then you throw it in the wash afterwards, it might twist and completely ruin your garment. And that is just super sad. We don't want that to happen. So just pre-wash it. The next thing we need is sewing thread. And since this is jersey, I'm sewing with an overlocker, so I need 4 threads. Then we're also going to be doing some stitching with our regular sewing machine, so we need a ballpoint needle for that. It's also called jersey needle or stretch needle, depending on where you buy it. I'm going to be doing all of my top stitching with a twin needle, which also needs to be ballpoint, and I am using a 4mm one. The reason you should always use a ballpoint needle when sewing jersey or knits in general is because a sharp regular needle might break the thread of your fabric. And since knitted fabric is made with like loops using one thread rather than 2 or more like woven fabric, if you break that one thread with your needle, for example, your entire fabric might come unraveled. And using a ballpoint needle avoids that because the needle point will go between the threads rather than going through them. If you want to use the same needles that I'm using, I've linked the ones that I have in the description. And then finally, I need some sewing thread for the stitching that I'm doing on my regular sewing machine. So for my pieces, I have my back body, which you can recognize by the neckline. It's less deep than the front. I have my front body, which then of course has a deeper neckline than my back. When you cut your body pieces, you want to cut a notch on the fold, so one for the center front and one for the center back. You don't need to do this on the hem, only on the neckline. I have my sleeves and I'm doing long sleeved, so I have 2 of those. And on the crown, I have my shoulder notch. Then I have my collar for the neckline, which has 3 notches, well, 6, because it's 1 on each side. And it's for one of the shoulders, and then the center front and the center back. I'm going to start with overlocking the hems on my sleeves and my body pieces. Then I'll overlock my shoulder seams together, right sides facing each other. I know I did the whole speech about like not using a regular needle, you gotta use ballpoint, and then I'm using regular pins. But look, I am like wiggling these pins through my fabric when I'm putting it in to make sure that I don't break a thread. So if you want to use pins, you gotta be careful, wiggle them through, it's a bit risky. You could also use clips. That works really well for jersey. I'm not a big fan of them. I prefer the pins. You know, you find whatever works for you, or just don't pin at all, just wing it. My shoulder seams are done, and I will now pin my seam allowance to the back of the body. And I'll attach my sleeves. So I'll locate my shoulder notch on my sleeve crown and make sure that you pin front sleeve to front body and back sleeve to back body. The front and back sleeve crowns are indicated on the pattern, but you can also recognize this because the front sleeve crown is shorter compared to the back sleeve crown. Pin your shoulder notch to the shoulder seam and your armhole points together, and then pin the rest of the curve. I'm also paying attention to the direction of my pins. I'm placing my pins on the side that I know will not be cut by the knife of the overlocker in case I forget to remove them in time. So just small things to be aware of, but they make a big difference. Do that on both sides and overlock. The sleeve is attached and we'll now close the sleeve seam and the body side seam in one go. I'll pin my armhole seam allowance into the sleeve. Match up my hems and then pin along the full side. And then overlock both sides. Next, I'll take my collar and I'll overlock one long edge of the collar, doesn't matter which one. Then I'll fold it right sides facing each other and overlock the short edges together. Now I'll take my t-shirt and I'll work on the neckline. So I'll take my collar piece and I'll match up the seam of the collar to one of the shoulder seams. It doesn't really matter which side you put it on, but think about what makes most sense for you. For example, I have a side part and most of the time I have hair falling on my right shoulder, so it makes sense for me to align my collar seam with my right shoulder for it to be less obvious. So I'm going to place my shoulder seam allowance towards the back again, and the collar seam allowance I'll direct to the front. To reduce bulk, I'll pin this together right sides facing each other, then I'll align my center back notches, my shoulder notch with the other shoulder seam, again pinning the seam allowance of the shoulder to the back, and the third notch with my center front. Overlock this together. This is the last thing we're overlocking, so you don't need your overlocker anymore after this step. Now this is what it looks like. The collar is attached to the neckline, but it's not done yet. We'll sew kind of a basting stitch. It's not a basting stitch because it's not loose or temporary, but it is a placeholder stitch. So with the right sides facing each other, we'll now sew a zigzag stitch using your regular sewing machine around the full neckline opening and 1.5 centimeters from the overlocked edge of the neckline. Switch out your needle to your ballpoint needle and just use a regular zigzag stitch. You want the zigzag stitch furthest from your neckline edge to be at 1.5 centimeters. This is what it looks like now. I've added my label here to make it look a little fancy. So I'll fold over my collar, covering my zigzag stitch and aligning my overlocked edge of the neckline right in the center of that fold. The reason I do the collar this way is because it's like a foolproof way of always getting a neatly finished binded neckline, and it makes the neckline a little thicker, which in my opinion gives the garment a more high quality feel. And here where my collar seam aligns with my shoulder seam, it might get a little bulky. It's going to make it more difficult to sew, it's going to be less of a neat finish because of that, and it might also feel a little uncomfortable if we leave it this way. So we're going to do some cutting. So next to my zigzag stitch on the collar, I'll do a little discreet snip, not too deep, okay, because you don't want to cut your seam, but just a little cut, and I'll fold that seam allowance in the opposite direction. And then I'll cut the seam allowance again in the collar fold and fold it in the opposite direction. This way I am distributing the bulk of this seam between the front and the back. Now I'll pin that in place all along the neckline, ensuring that the collar fold over covers my zigzag stitch on the inside of the garment. And then I'll top stitch that in place using my twin needle. By using the twin needle, you keep the stretch of the fabric intact. I'll sew my top stitch like 2 millimeters from the edge of the collar neckline. And this is what it will look like. Final step is to hem your garments, sleeves and bottom edge. So I'll just iron down a 1.5 centimeter fold. I'll be doing the same thing with the seam allowance on the hem as I did on the collar. So the seam allowance on my side seam, I want facing backwards. And then I'll cut my seam allowance slightly right in the fold and direct the seam allowance on the hem to the front, so in the opposite direction. Again, this is to reduce bulk and to ensure a nice, neat finish. Finally, I'll just top stitch my hems down using my twin needle again, and that is it. This is what it looks like, and that's your garment done. If you have any questions regarding the pattern or the sewing, just send me a message. I'm always here to help. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. And remember to tag me at @SuitoCarolinaShear and use the hashtag #CSEssentialTea if you post your finished make on Instagram or TikTok. Until next time, bye!